So 2 months ago, I undertook the colossal task of watching the entirety of One Piece. And holy guacamole, this show was just incredible. But despite this, my One Piece journey was one hell of a roller coaster. I went from loving the show to never being so damn bored in my whole life, to almost quitting and then back to loving it. Anyways, being so I just finished One Piece, I thought why not make a review series on the show to make me losing 2 goddamn months of my life slightly more worthwhile. But enough of the yap, let's get into why you clicked on this video. So Romancestor is the first arc of One Piece, and it will always hold a special place in my heart. But let me get this straight. Before I got into One Piece and decided that I wanted to watch the show, my friends had shown me a couple clips from the anime, and that was from Wano. So as you can imagine, with little research, my expectations of the animation were very, very high. So when I clicked onto episode 1 of One Piece, I genuinely almost dropped the show there and then. Like, why in the Kentucky Fried Chicken is the animation so bad that my nan could probably do a better job? Regardless of the animation, which also is to be expected, it was made in the late 90s, I would say that Romancestor was pretty good at establishing Luffy and Zoro's characters, and I guess you couldn't ask for much more from a first arc, especially being so short. But with that said, I am gonna have to put this in C, just because nothing really interesting happened, and even the villain was just extremely lackluster. Now, Orange Town was very similar to Romancestor. Not a lot really occurred. Buggy was a funny gag character, but for such a short arc, the pacing was still pretty rubbish. But with that said, the story of the store owner's dog was actually very emotional, and it may or may not have brought a tear to my eye. But apart from that, I didn't really feel myself that emotionally invested in this arc, like I was in some of the arcs to come. And it wasn't until much later that I genuinely saw myself enjoying this series. So I'm gonna have to put this one in C, just because of how meaningless it felt at the time. Anyways, next up we have Syrup Village, and I think out of the last 3 arcs I've discussed, this arc definitely suffers the most from pacing. If we are totally honest, Syrup Village could have just straight up avoided some of the things which happened. Like for example, why on earth was Luffy snoozing for 3 episodes straight necessary for this arc? It just felt really boring for the most part. However, I must say the actual story for this island was much better than the previous arcs. It also did an amazing job at establishing Usopp as a character, and I loved how Usopp perfectly represented the story of the boy who cried wolf. It just made a lot of sense for his character. So I would give this arc a B, just because it did a much better job at establishing a solid storyline, as well as it also had a very strategic villain, which was the first time we'd probably seen this. Now, Baratier was quite similar to Syrup Village, with the fact that it did an amazing job at introducing the new Straw Hat member. However, what we did see was Mihawk, and I can wholeheartedly say that I was not ready to see Zoro just get his cheeks absolutely decimated by a butter knife. But it was very important establishing Zoro's final goal, and it's crazy to see how far this goal has actually taken him as a character, even in the likes like Wano or Egghead. But it also showed us how far out of reach this goal currently was for Zoro, and it kind of opened up the world of One Piece, and it just showed us how strong people actually were out in the Grand Line. And just for the Mihawk fight alone, as well as how Sanji was introduced, I would give it a B. But let it be known that without Goathawk, I would be hard pushed to even give this one a C. Anyways, next up is Arlong Park, and this arc is where One Piece actually gets interesting in my opinion. For starters, the story surrounding Arlong Park was just incredible. It took the best parts from each arc thus far and just shoved it into one. So far in the story, Nami just seemed to be like your generic character without anything surrounding her, but her backstory just gave a whole new perspective on her character at the time. And the final fight in Arlong Park just perfectly wrapped up such an amazing arc. But there was one glaring problem which I haven't really discussed yet, and that is definitely pacing. Watching this arc was so long, and it just dragged for what felt like forever. And this is probably because literally nothing happens for so long, but when stuff did happen, it was just complete chaos. But I think the reason people think this arc was so incredible is just because they remember how great the Arlong fight was, as well as Nami's backstory. But like I just said earlier, that isn't really what I'm rating these arcs based off of. And I do remember just how incredibly bored I was whilst watching Arlong Park for the most part. And for that reason alone, I'm gonna have to rate this arc an A. But with better pacing, this arc could so easily climb to be an S. Loguetown was the official introduction of the Grand Line, and this basically opened up an entire new world for One Piece. The arc itself wasn't the most interesting, but it did have some cool concepts like being the place of Roger's execution. But if I'm totally honest, we didn't need to spend so long on Luffy just wandering around. Also, this was the introduction of Logia type devil fruits, and similar to when we saw Mihawk, I remember thinking, how on earth will Luffy's dumbass get to this kind of power? Obviously we find out later in the story, but when I was a lot more naive in the One Piece verse, these were all thoughts which were popping up in my mind. And at the time, it makes people like Smoker just so much better of a villain. But Lotan obviously had quite a few important references for later, with that idea of Luffy and Goldie Roger on the execution stand, both smiling before their death. And obviously had Dragon pulling up and silencing Smoker. So Lotan was a solid arc with slightly less problems with the pacing, so I would definitely give it a B. Reverse Mountain was a cool arc which was incredibly short, and we obviously get introduced to Laboon, and if I'm totally honest, this arc just felt kind of meaningless. It's just an introduction to what the Grand Line entails, but if I'm totally honest, we didn't need to spend 2 episodes or however long it was, just like kind of seeing Laboon's backstory. So that is why I'll just put this one in C. Whiskey Peak is another extremely short arc, but it's obviously just some setup for Alabaster. I can't even lie, when I was going back through the list of arcs, I forgot this one even existed. Again, this isn't a bad arc, it just seems kind of pointless. I liked how Vivi was introduced, and Zoro has a pretty cool moment when he defeats like those 100 bounty hunters, but you could tell when you were watching this arc that it's only used for setup. So the arc on the surface is probably just a C. So next up is Little Garden. And I love the concept for this arc, with the 2 giants being locked in a constant battle for over 100 years. And I also love the idea of the giants being in the series altogether. The fact that they seem like so dissociated with the rest of the world, and they kind of lived like as their own entity, was another cool feature about them. This is also the first arc where we actually see a bit of character development from Usopp, which felt long overdue by this point in the anime. With that said, I think this arc is just an easy B, as I didn't really mind the pacing throughout, and the story surrounding it felt quite cool. So Drum Island is up next, and this is when we see the next Straw Hat introduced, and that being Chopper of course. But for now, I'm just going to ignore Chopper for a second. I just want to appreciate how insane Luffy's feats were during this arc. He carries Sanji and a dying Nami all the way up an entire mountain while he was freezing and injured himself. It was just a huge display of the lengths Luffy would go to for his crew, and I love seeing that side of his character. Anyways, let's move on to the actual story behind this arc. I feel like there was always something like somewhat relevant occurring, and I don't feel like we spent too long watching stuff like Luffy wandering around or snoozing like we did in Zero Village. But if I'm going to be brutally honest, Wapol was a bit of a rubbish villain. But genuinely, that's probably like the only downside I see to this arc. Chopper's backstory was amazing, and I would say it is either the best or the second best backstory from all the Straw Hat. The fact that he aspired to be an amazing doctor and then feeds his mentor something fatal, to then realize that he has done this and then just going absolutely nuts. Like the emotion that was conveyed during these flashbacks was just unrivaled. But I would most likely rank this a B just because of how rubbish Wapol is. And here we go, it is time for Alabaster, the longest arc by far at this point in One Piece. But Jesus Christ, could you tell this was a long one? I don't know where to start, so I'm just going to talk about the negatives of this arc to get them out of the way. And this is going to be a recurring theme in most of these arcs, but a major problem was definitely the pacing. I think being so this was Oda's first big arc, and the amount of setup that we had done for this saga, I think Oda thought they had to make up for that by making a long arc with as much depth in it as possible. But I just don't think he got it right here, as we spent so long on certain plot points which just felt unnecessary. But apart from pacing, this arc was just amazing. I think this was the first time that we actually saw the Straw Hats matching up against an opponent of their skill level, rather than just following Luffy around, watching him beat up anyone that he doesn't like. Also, Crocodile was an amazing villain, and I think it was the first time that we properly saw a methodical antagonist, and I loved that part of this arc. Like, Crocodile's presence was just so incredibly ominous, it sent shivers down my spine. And then obviously we had Luffy getting destroyed by Crocodile, which was probably the first time we properly saw him lose, but every single one of the Straw Hats fights was just incredible. And like I said, this is the first time that we properly saw the Straw Hats have a 1v1 fight, as well as being able to grow throughout one. Zoro's fight was crazy with him having to understand how to cut through steel. Usopp actually did something for once and stood up to his opponent, which was another amazing bit of character progression for him, and the same could be said for Nami and Sanji, with them both having to overcome adversity to beat their opponents. And this was just showing why the Straw Hats were just a completely different breed. But another cool part of this arc would have been Ace. However, Ace on his own isn't necessarily the interesting part. It was seeing how different Luffy's relationship with Ace was compared to his crew or anyone else in the series. And obviously the poneglyphs were introduced here, and they were an incredible addition, which actually shaped up to be one of the most important revelations in the entire series. And with all of what happened in this arc, I would be hard pushed not to give this an S. And I think where there's bad pacing, there will equally be a thorough story. And this arc was the perfect depiction of this. So next up we have the Jaya arc. This was obviously another setup arc for the coming Skypiea. However, unlike some of the other ones so far, it didn't seem entirely meaningless, but this arc definitely had some compelling moments. For example, when Luffy and Zoro simply let Bellamy beat the crap out of them was some of the most character development we had seen from the Straw Hats thus far in the series. This was a clear display of Luffy's unwavering desire to protect his crew, and it also shows the difference in ideologies between captains in the series. We have the captains who completely disregard their crew and view them as underlings in comparison to those who sit as equals to them. And I think these clashes in ideologies is why One Piece has such amazing world building. But getting back on track, I'm assuming Luffy is just taking a page out of Shanks' book here, clearly showing the influence Shanks has on Luffy. But obviously Luffy made sure to come back to make sure Bellamy knew that he was still little bro when it didn't put his crew in danger. Again, for such a short arc, it has quite a nice storyline, and for that reason I would give this arc a B. A very solid setup arc, which is very close to being an A. So Skypiea is next, and I think it is very similar in length to Alabaster, but I feel like it just wasn't as successful when it came to the overarching story. Obviously you have the terror of Enel over the citizens, but apart from that there just really wasn't much else to this arc. I think it just lacks the depth most of One Piece's long arcs really have, but it still did have the same problems of pacing as these long arcs. I do think Enel was introduced way too late into the arc, and as an actual villain, he didn't seem too cunning and rather just a straight up powerhouse. But with those negatives out of the way, I absolutely loved the concept of the arc's design. The concept of a sky island with squishy paths and being able to swim in the clouds was just straight up incredible. Sky Island as an island itself is probably my second favorite actual island, and I think that is why I just like this arc so much. But what was cool to see was Nika and Robin's little adventure. We obviously saw her deciphering the poneglyphs and going to that abandoned city. And I think this was just so unique about this arc, because thus far in the story, it seemed that the main goal of the Straw Hats was to defeat the main villain. But this was the first time that we saw one of the Straw Hats actually taking on their own side quest, which wasn't just looking for beetles like Luffy would. Another problem with this arc was I don't feel like Luffy should have gotten away with killing such a strong opponent just because he's a direct counter to Enel's Devil Fruit. We see pretty evidently later in the series how Devil Fruits are most certainly not everything to a user's power, but in the case of Enel, he seemed basically useless without his, as he was able to get destroyed by like a pre-timeskip Luffy. But we know Oda doesn't care about power scaling, so it is what it is, I guess. Anyways, Enel's mantra was actually an insane ability. It was very fitting for like the god of Skypiea, so that is why I'd say Oda nailed it. So I'm going to give this arc a solid A, but with a bit more development of the like actual Sky Island as well as Enel as a villain, it could easily go to an S tier. So that is going to wrap it up for part 1 of the One Piece arc review series. I already have started working on part 2, so hopefully you can expect to see that video very soon. And if you did enjoy part 1, then make sure to smash the like button, so this video can reach more people. On top of that, if you want to support the channel, then please consider subscribing, as it helps out the channel massively, and would mean a lot to me. We are trying to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and with your help we should be able to make it there. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and leave any feedback you have in the comments down below, and with that all said, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.